In the shadow of a dying king, Europe held its breath. The year was 1700. The sun that had once risen over an empire where it never set was setting, not just on a monarch, but on an entire world order. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg to wear the Spanish crown, lay gasping in Madrid, childless, broken, and haunted by centuries of inbreeding. His death would not merely end a reign, it would ignite a war that would rage across continents, redraw borders, and birth a new dynasty on Iberian soil. And at the eye of this storm stood a boy king, just 17 years old, plucked from the gilded salons of Versailles and thrust onto a throne drenched in blood, prophecy, and uncertainty. His name? Philip. But history would remember him as Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. Few rulers have inherited a crown so heavy with consequence. Born Philippe de France, Duke of Anjou, he was the second grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King. To the French court, he was a spare heir, a quiet teenager with melancholic eyes and a stammer. But to Spain, he was a promise or a threat. For Charles II, in his final desperate act, bypassed Austrian Habsburg claims and named this French Bourbon as his successor. In doing so, he ignited the fuse of the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict so vast it would draw in England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Portugal, Savoy, and dozens of German states. At its heart, one question: would Europe tolerate a union of France and Spain under one royal house? The answer would be written in fire, cannon smoke, and the blood of thousands. Philip V's arrival in Spain was less a coronation and more a gamble. He landed in Cadiz in early 1701, a foreign prince in a land that feared French domination. Yet, to the astonishment of his skeptics, the young king did not ride in with arrogance. He learned Spanish, painstakingly, passionately. He adopted Spanish dress, attended Mass with visible devotion, and deferred to local ministers like the Duke of Medinaceli and later Cardinal Portocarrero. He even kissed the ground upon his first steps into Madrid. But admiration alone could not stop war. By 1702, the Grand Alliance, England, Austria, and the Dutch, declared war. They backed Archduke Charles of Austria as the true King of Spain. Suddenly, Philip was not just a monarch. He was a symbol of resistance against a coalition determined to dismantle Spain's sovereignty. The early years of Philip's reign were defined by military catastrophe and political isolation. Allied forces swept through Catalonia, Aragon, and Valencia, regions that resented Castilian dominance and saw the Habsburg claimant as liberation. Barcelona fell in 1705. Philip fled Madrid twice, once in 1706, when Archduke Charles entered the capital in triumph. For a moment, it seemed the Bourbon dream was over. But then something shifted. The Castilian heartland, Old Castile, Andalusia, Extremadura, rallied behind Philip. Not out of love for France, but out of fear of fragmentation. They saw in Philip not a foreign invader, but a unifying force against regional separatism. This loyalty became his lifeline. With French military aid, he reclaimed Madrid in 1707 and crushed the Habsburg-backed rebels at the Battle of Almansa, a turning point that would haunt eastern Spain for generations. Beneath the battlefield smoke, another revolution was unfolding, one of administration, identity, and centralization. Philip V, Guided by his shrewd French advisors and later by Spanish reformers like José de Grimaldo, began dismantling the ancient patchwork of Spanish kingdoms. The old realms, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, had each governed themselves under their own laws, courts, and privileges. To Philip and his ministers, this was chaos. Unity required uniformity. Thus began the Nueva Planta Decrees, a series of royal edicts that abolished regional constitutions, suppressed local parliaments, and imposed Castilian law across the peninsula. Catalonia would not forgive this for centuries. But for the Spanish state, it was the birth of modern administration. The kingdom was no longer a federation of crowns. It was, for the first time, Spain, singular, centralized, and Bourbon. Yet even as he remade the nation, Philip struggled within. His letters reveal a man plagued by doubt, insomnia, and bouts of deep depression, what contemporaries called melancholy. He would vanish for days into his private chambers, refusing audiences, signing only the most urgent decrees. His wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, became his emotional anchor, intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely devoted. She governed in his stead during his fits of despair, earning the nickname the Little Queen with the Great Soul. Together, they forged a partnership that stabilized the crown during its most fragile years. But personal tragedy loomed. Maria Louisa died in 1714, exhausted by 13 pregnancies and relentless political pressure. Philip was shattered. Within months, he married Elisabeth Farnese, an Italian princess with ambition as sharp as a stiletto. She would change the course of his reign and Europe's balance of power. By 1713, the war was ending, not with total victory, but with compromise. The Treaty of Utrecht recognized Philip V as King of Spain, on one brutal condition: he and his heirs must forever renounce any claim to the French throne. Spain lost its European empire: Gibraltar, Minorca, Naples, Sardinia, the Spanish Netherlands, but retained its vast American colonies. For many Spaniards, it felt like humiliation, but for Philip, it was survival. He kept the crown. And with peace came the chance to rebuild. The stage was set not for conquest, but for reform, for turning a shattered empire into a modern state. And in that transformation, Philip V would reveal himself not just as a survivor, but as an architect of Spain's future. Peace should have brought relief. Instead, it unveiled new enemies within. The Treaty of Utrecht may have silenced cannons, but it could not quiet the whispers of betrayal in Madrid's corridors. To many Spaniards, the loss of Italy and the Netherlands was a national disgrace. To foreign powers, Philip V remained a dangerous anomaly, a Bourbon on the Iberian throne, still married to a French princess, still dreaming, they feared, of uniting the two great crowns. But the greatest threat to Philip's reign did not come from Vienna or London. It came from his own mind. The melancholy that had shadowed him since youth deepened into a chasm after Maria Louisa's death. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at candle flames, unable to speak, let alone rule. In those dark hours, Spain teetered on the edge of administrative collapse, until a new force emerged from the Queen's quarters: Elisabeth Farnese. She was not Spanish, she was not meek, and she was not content to be a grieving widow's replacement. Born in Parma in 1692, Elisabeth Farnese possessed a will of steel and a vision that extended far beyond Madrid's palace walls. While Philip retreated into solitude, she stepped into the void with breathtaking audacity. Within months of their marriage, she dismissed French advisors, installed Italian confidants like Cardinal Alberoni, and began plotting a bold new strategy. If Spain could not keep its European territories, it would reclaim them, not through war with the great powers, but through dynastic cunning. Her eyes were fixed on Italy. Her sons, future kings, would rule Parma, Tuscany, and Naples. This was not mere maternal ambition. It was geopolitical genius wrapped in silk and whispered through diplomatic channels. Under Elizabeth's influence, Spain re-entered the European arena, not as a broken giant, but as a shrewd player in the Game of Thrones. Alberoni, her protégé and new chief minister, masterminded a daring plan, ally with France and Britain, to dismantle the Habsburg grip on Italy. In 1717, Spanish troops landed in Sardinia. A year later, they seized Sicily. Europe gasped. The Quadruple Alliance, Britain, France, Austria, and the Dutch Republic, responded with fury. The War of the Quadruple Alliance erupted. Once again, Spanish ships were sunk, armies repelled. The dream of Italian restoration seemed shattered. Alberoni was exiled. Yet Elizabeth refused to yield. She understood that war was only one tool. Diplomacy, patience, and royal bloodlines could achieve what cannons could not. Her moment came in 1729. Through the Treaty of Seville, brokered with Britain and France, Spain secured recognition that her eldest son, Don Carlos, would inherit the Duchy of Parma. A few years later, during the War of the Polish Succession, Spanish forces marched into Naples and Sicily, this time with international blessing. In 1734, Don Carlos entered Naples as its king. The Bourbon dynasty now ruled not just Spain, but southern Italy. Elizabeth had done what generations of Habsburgs failed to do: plant her children on multiple thrones through strategy, not just force. Philip, though still prone to fits of depression, watched with quiet pride. His wife had given him something he could never win on the battlefield: legacy. At home, the king's reign entered a new phase of reform. Freed from constant warfare after 1720, Philip turned his attention inward. With ministers like Patiño and Ensenada, he launched what historians call the Bourbon reforms, a sweeping modernization of Spain's economy, military, and bureaucracy. The old Habsburg system, riddled with tax exemptions, local privileges, and inefficient monopolies, was dismantled. New ministries were created: navy, finance, war. Roads were built. Shipbuilding boomed in Cadiz and Havana. The Spanish Navy, once a shadow of its former self, began to rise again, critical for protecting treasure fleets from British and Dutch pirates. In the colonies, intendancies were established to centralize control, boost revenue, and suppress smuggling. The goal was clear: turn Spain into a rational, efficient, and powerful state capable of competing in the modern world. But reform bred resentment. The nobility, stripped of their traditional powers and tax immunities, grumbled in their palaces. The church, whose vast lands were now scrutinized by royal accountants, saw its influence wane. In Catalonia and Valencia, memories of the Nueva Planta decrees festered like open wounds. Yet, the common people, farmers, artisans, merchants, often benefited. Lower internal tariffs meant cheaper goods. Royal investment in infrastructure created jobs. And for the first time in centuries, Spaniards felt a flicker of national pride. Under Philip V, Spain was no longer the decaying relic of imperial glory. It was a nation rebuilding, not just surviving. Still, the king's inner demons never fully left. In 1724, in a moment that stunned Europe, Philip abdicated in favor of his 17-year-old son, Louis I. He claimed exhaustion, spiritual calling, a desire to retire to a monastery. But historians suspect deeper motives, perhaps another spiral of depression, or even manipulation by court factions. The abdication lasted just 7 months. Louis XIV, bright and promising, contracted smallpox and died. Philip, grief-stricken but duty-bound, reclaimed the crown. It was a haunting echo of his own youth, throne gained through another's death. From that point on, he ruled with renewed if weary resolve. He would not abandon Spain again. The later years of his reign were marked by a paradox, a reclusive king presiding over a resurgent empire. He rarely appeared in public, preferring the solitude of La Granja Palace in the Segovian mountains, where he built gardens inspired by Versailles and filled them with fountains that played music. Yet from those secluded chambers, decrees flowed that shaped the future. He strengthened ties with France through the Pacte de Famille, family compacts that aligned Bourbon powers against Habsburg and British influence. He invested in education, founding the Royal Library and supporting scientific academies. And though he never saw his Italian sons again after they left for their thrones, he took solace in their success. Don Carlos would later become Charles III of Spain, one of the nation's greatest reformers. The dynasty was secure, but storms gathered on the horizon. Britain, now dominant in global trade, grew bolder in challenging Spain's colonial monopoly. Smugglers flew the Union Jack with impunity. Spanish coast guards seized British ships, leading to the infamous Jenkins' Ear incident in 1731. War loomed again. And though Philip would not live to see the War of Jenkins' Ear explode in 1739, his policies had laid the groundwork for Spain's defiant stand. He had transformed a bankrupt, fragmented kingdom into a centralized state with a professional army, a growing navy, and a coherent foreign policy. The Sun King's grandson had not just inherited a crown, he had forged a new Spain. The mountains of Segovia held secrets even kings could not escape. At the royal palace of La Granja, surrounded by marble statues and hydraulic marvels that mimicked Versailles, Philip V spent his final years in quiet torment. The fountains played their symphonies, but the king heard only silence, the silence of a mind retreating from the world. His hands, once steady enough to sign decrees that reshaped empires, now trembled. His eyes, which had watched fleets sail to Naples and armies march through Catalonia, grew dim with fatigue. Yet, in those twilight years, the legacy of his reign pulsed through every corner of Spain, not in grand monuments, but in systems, laws, and a new idea of nationhood. He had ruled for nearly half a century, longer than any Spanish monarch before him. And in doing so, he had buried the old Spain and planted the seeds of the modern one. But to understand Philip V's true impact, one must look beyond palaces and treaties, to the streets of Madrid, the ports of Cadiz, the silver mines of Potosi. The Bourbon reforms, initiated under his watch, were not abstract policies. They were lifelines. When royal inspectors cracked down on contraband, legal trade flourished. When standardized weights and measures were introduced, markets became fairer. When the state invested in shipbuilding, dock workers in Ferrol and Cartagena found steady wages. For the first time since the golden age of Philip II, Spain's economy showed signs of vitality. Revenue from the Americas doubled between 1700 and 1750. The colonial bureaucracy, once a labyrinth of corruption, began to function with ruthless efficiency. All of this bore the invisible stamp of Philip V, a king who ruled more through ministers than manifestos, yet whose vision guided every decision. Abroad, his dynastic strategy reached its zenith. His son Ferdinand became Duke of Parma. His son Charles ruled Naples, then ascended the Spanish throne as Charles III after Philip's line died out. Another son, Philip, founded the Bourbon Parma line. Through Elizabeth's relentless diplomacy, the Bourbons became Europe's most expansive royal network, stretching from Madrid to Naples to Parma. This was no accident. It was a deliberate counterweight to Habsburg dominance, and it worked. When the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756, after Philip's death, Spain entered not as a weakened afterthought, but as a key player in the Bourbon alliance. The foundations had been laid in those quiet years at La Granja, where a depressed king and an ambitious queen redrew the map with ink, not blood. Yet, not all was progress. The centralization that brought efficiency also bred oppression. In Catalonia, the Catalan language was banned from official use. Local institutions were erased. The memory of 1714, when Barcelona fell after a brutal siege, became a rallying cry for generations of Catalan nationalists. Even today, September 11th is commemorated as Catalonia's National Day, a silent rebuke to Philip V's legacy. In the colonies, increased taxation and stricter control sparked unrest. The very reforms that strengthened the crown sowed seeds of future rebellion. The irony is profound. The man who saved Spain from disintegration may have planted the first roots of its eventual fragmentation. Still, Philip's personal story remains one of the most human in royal history. He was not a warrior king like his great-grandfather Louis XIV. He was not a philosopher monarch like Frederick the Great. He was a man plagued by mental illness in an age that had no name for it, no treatment for it, only stigma. His melancholy would today be recognized as clinical depression, possibly bipolar disorder. Yet he ruled. He adapted. He leaned on strong women, first Maria Louisa, then Elizabeth, allowing them to govern when he could not. In an era when kings were expected to be divine and infallible, Philip V's vulnerability made him strangely modern. He reminds us that leadership is not about never falling, but about rising again and again, even when your soul feels like lead. His final years were a slow fade. He remarried no one after Elizabeth. He saw his children ascend thrones, yet remained distant, almost spectral. He attended Mass daily, prayed fervently, and spoke little. When he died on July 9, 1746, at the age of 62, Spain did not collapse. It did not fracture. It endured because he had built it to. His successor, Ferdinand VI, inherited a stable treasury, a professional military, and a unified legal framework. The Bourbon system worked. The experiment had succeeded. And though historians debate whether Philip was great or merely fortunate, one truth is undeniable. He saved Spain from oblivion. But his story does not end in 1746. It echoes in every Spanish passport, every centralized ministry, every national law that treats Spain as one country, not a collection of kingdoms. It lives in the Bourbon dynasty that still sits on the Spanish throne today. And it whispers in the tension between Madrid and Barcelona, a tension born in the fires of war and decree. Philip V was a foreigner who became more Spanish than the Spaniards, a depressive who ruled longer than almost any monarch in European history. A king who lost an empire in Europe but preserved a greater one overseas. His reign was not glamorous, but it was necessary. And in the quiet corridors of history, necessity often outshines glory. Imagine a Spain without Philip V, a fractured peninsula, Catalonia independent, Aragon autonomous, Castile isolated. An empire crumbling under Habsburg inertia, its silver fleets easy prey for British pirates. A monarchy so weak it becomes a pawn in Austrian or French games. This was the abyss Spain faced in 1700. And it was Philip V, this melancholic, stammering boy from Versailles, who pulled the nation back from the edge. Not with charisma, not with conquest, but with endurance, reform, and an unyielding belief in the idea of Spain as one sovereign entity. His reign was not the stuff of epic ballads. It was the slow, grinding work of state-building. And it is precisely this quiet revolution that made modern Spain possible. Today, as we walk through Madrid's Puerta del Sol or sail past Gibraltar's defiant cliffs, we tread on ground shaped by Philip's decisions. The centralized state, the unified legal code, the professional army, the colonial administration, all bear his imprint. Even Spain's current constitutional monarchy traces its legitimacy back to the Bourbon line he founded. And yet, he remains one of history's most misunderstood kings, vilified by Catalans as a tyrant, dismissed by some historians as passive, overshadowed by his wife and successors. But look closer. In his willingness to learn Spanish, to embrace local customs, to suffer in silence for the sake of stability, there lies a profound form of patriotism. He did not love Spain as a conqueror loves land. He loved it as a steward loves a fragile heirloom, knowing that to preserve it, he must sometimes break it apart and reassemble it stronger. His legacy is not without shadows. The suppression of regional identities left wounds that still bleed. The colonial reforms, while efficient, tightened the grip on indigenous populations and fueled future independence movements. And his reliance on foreign-born queens and ministers bred xenophobia that lingered for generations. But history is not a ledger of perfect choices. It is a record of difficult ones made under pressure. Philip V chose unity over fragmentation, modernity over nostalgia, survival over pride. In doing so, he traded short-term glory for long-term resilience, and Spain, for all its later turmoil, never again faced the existential threat it did in 1700. As the 18th century unfolded, the world Philip helped create would face new challenges: Enlightenment ideals, revolutionary fervor, Napoleonic invasion. But thanks to his reforms, Spain entered that turbulent era not as a corpse, but as a living nation with institutions capable of adaptation. His great-grandson, Charles III, would become the best mayor of Madrid and a model enlightened despot. His dynasty would survive civil wars, republics, and dictatorships. And in 2025, King Felipe VI, direct descendant of Philip V, still reigns. The Bourbons endure. Spain endures. And it all began with a boy who never wanted to be king, but became the king Spain needed. So why does this matter to us now? Because Philip V's story is not just about crowns and treaties. It's about identity in crisis, leadership in darkness, and the courage to rebuild when everything seems lost. In an age of polarization, where nations fracture along cultural and regional lines, his struggle to unify a divided land speaks with eerie relevance. His mental health battles remind us that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the will to carry on despite it. And his partnership with two extraordinary queens shows that true power often flows through collaboration, not command. If you've journeyed this far with us through the life of Philip V, you've done more than learn history. You've witnessed the quiet birth of a nation. And this is just one story among thousands hidden in the archives of Spain's past. From the origin of Seville's name to the secrets of the Alhambra, from the ghost ships of the Spanish Armada to the flamenco rhythms of Andalusia, every stone, every street, every surname in Spain carries a tale waiting to be told. If you've felt the pull of these stories, if your heart races at the whisper of forgotten kings, buried treaties, and revolutionary dreams, then you belong here. Our channel is dedicated to unearthing the why behind Alabama's landmarks, but also to exploring the deeper currents of history that shape us all. Because understanding where we come from is the first step to imagining where we're going. Don't let this journey end here. Tap that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our community of curious minds. Because history isn't just in books, it's alive, breathing, and waiting for you to discover it. And who knows, the next story might just change how you see the world. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop wondering why.